Okay, starting again. Poor physical condition. If panelists have a fever or cold, poor dental hygiene, or have emotional upset or work stress, we ask them not to come in. I had a panelist whose husband was dying from cancer. She was taking care of him, and we allowed her to come in, but made the decision not to use her data because of the emotional upset and her ability to concentrate differed across days. But I still wanted her to be a panelist. She was a wonderful panelist, and so you have to make those decisions. Panelists who smoke, I've only had one panelist who smoked, and they had to have their last cigarette 60 minutes before evaluation, and then brush their teeth. You can't drink coffee 60 minutes before panel. It's the hardest thing for me. For having panel at 9, I have to have my last sip of coffee at 8 o'clock. It's traumatic. Can't eat within 2 hours of tasting. We really like to run our panel between 10 and noon because that's when people are most awake and their mental powers are peaked and when they're not hungry. And we also find that gives them a chance to get a few things done, get here, it's a lot more relaxed. So when we're doing a trained panel, we have a panel leader, and they're the one who conducts the sensory test and interprets the findings. They have to know sensory principles, they have to know the things that we talked about in a lot more detail, the testing environment, environmental effects, and product sampling. In our trained panel, ASTM says you need at least 5 panelists, AMSA says 8 panelists. Actually having good, well-trained panels are the most important thing. And we monitor training. Every study we do additional training, and we validate the panel. After we've conducted a study, I actually evaluate the panel and the efficacy of the panelists. So we're all the time evaluating how good the panel is. So that if anybody ever questions, well, you have sensory data, is it good, is it reliable, is it repeatable? I have an answer for that for each study. And we use paid panelists because they're a little bit more highly motivated. How do we create or get a trained panel? I'm going to go through this pretty rapidly. First, we do panel recruitment, and we have a script, and we usually do this either over email to groups, and people call in, and then we talk to them and we ask them standard questions where we tell them what the probable demands of the job are, the role of the panelists, the contribution to the sensory program. And we let them know it's a part-time job, what the pay level is going to be, and also that we don't work every single day. It's not a full-time, part-time job. We're going to have periods where they don't work or where they need to work 4 days a week, for example. And we try to determine their dedication and punctuality. Probably about 75% of people who call when we're trying to do panel recruitment will not be acceptable because it's not something that they want to do. Then we bring them in for screening, and we'll use a triangle test where we'll do meat samples because that's what we deal with. When we did a coffee panel, we did coffee samples in our screening. And we do triangle tests, which we're going to talk about more here in a minute, where you have 3 samples, and one of them is different and 2 of them are the same. And they have to pick out the one that is different. And we give them samples that are at least 2 points in difference, so that's a marked difference. And they sit in the booth and they actually do the testing. And then from that, we either accept, reject, or continue testing. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide. We also do sniff tests, where we take Whatman filter paper, cut it into strips, and put it in essential oils, and put those in glass jars, and they sniff them, and we ask them to identify the attribute. What we're doing there is to see how creative they are, see if they understand differences in aromatics, and we just want to see that if they smell oak, that they at least put wood, not floral or rose down on it. And then we give them logic tests to see if they can make decisions and follow directions. And if somebody's passed these upper 2 and they can't pass the logic test or they read the directions wrong, I can tell you they cannot be a panelist because that means they can't follow directions. And that will haunt you. With the triangle test, and this is in the AMSA guidelines, we use this number of samples tested and then the number of triangles that they got correct. And we use this chart to put them in accept, continue testing, or reject. Some people end up in continuing testing, and as we test them more and more, we can't get them out of there, I reject them. Because we want people who can tell some difference and make a judgment. After we've done panel recruitment, panel screening, then we do panel training. And this can take from 6 months to a year. And what we're trying to do here is first familiarize them with the test procedures. I have to teach them how to eat a piece of meat on the same side of their mouth and how to spit that piece of meat out into a cup. I know it seems funny that people don't know how to do that, but some don't know how to do that. So all the test procedures we familiarize them with, and then we work in giving them examples where they'll improve their ability to recognize and identify sensory attributes. And then the rest of the testing is to improve their sensitivity and memory and permitting precise and consistent sensory judgments. We have to really concentrate or stress concentration, keep everything standardized, and give them very defined instructions. And during the training process, what we're doing as a panel leader is trying to identify those panelists who are doing well, what kind of exercises would be important to really help with the second and third objective. They're going to first start beginning by scaling one attribute, where with that attribute we use the ends of the scale and we help them identify smaller and smaller increments. We teach them to think of intensity level or toughness, tenderness, and we use standards or references. I brought a couple of references in here. You use the reference for umami, the accent. This is Flintstones with iron, and if you want to know what metallic is, you smell this. And this is citric acid that we use to make standards for salad. So those are the kind of things that we do. We provide them standards so that they have something they can go back to and keep them anchored. But training is never done. We're training all the time. Before we do a study, we always do performance evaluation, where we select 8 to 9 samples. Those represent full range of the scale. They're served in at least 3 sessions per day, 3 samples per session for 4 days. And then we analyze this with analysis of variance, and we statistically evaluate whether they've done well or not. I'm not going to get into a lot of those details, but I just want you to know that we do statistically evaluate our panelists to make sure that they're efficacious. And we'll talk more about that when you take the sensory class. The test forms, you want them so that they're actionable, that the people can use them, that you can show differences. And I'm not really going to get into a lot of examples of this. We tend to use, for the training panel, we use 0 to 15 point scales that are, it's called the universal scale. And for most of our meat panel, we use a 1 to 8 descriptive evaluation. They have to have enough points to be able to determine differences. When we do consumer work, we use 9-point scales because that gives them a neutral point and 4 points for like and 4 points for dislike to rate differences. The most important thing is that they have to be able to know how to use them and use them consistently across evaluations, and that they're comfortable with them. There are lots of options. So now what I want to do is talk about what type of panels do we have. There are basically 3 types or 3 areas or subject matters of panel. The first one is discriminative panels, and these are panels that tell differences or similarity in product. That's the whole goal. So Hannah, I'm going to move to the board right now, and I'm going to start down here. And I want to say, so what we've talked about so far have been factors that influence the sensory verdict. And we talked about test, environment, and sample controls. And all of this is done to make sure that we have repeatable results. Then we talked about the psychological and physical factors. And these two tie in together because what we're trying to do with both of these is make sure that we do not have anything else influencing the human's sensory verdict. Then we talked about how to recruit, screen, and train a panelist briefly. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about discriminative panels. These are the tools now, if we have all of this taken care of, that we can use. This is the testing procedures themselves. So discriminative is where we're going to ask for a difference. And there are different tools there. And if you take the sensory class, we'll get into more details on these. The most common tool is the paired comparison. And with paired comparison, what we do is we present two products. So I brought two products here. We would put these in cups of coffee and standardize their preparation so they're the same. If we want to know whether Starbucks breakfast blend and holiday blend from Cafe Olé, this is supposed to be a medium roast, this is supposed to be medium roast, are they the same or different? We would use a paired comparison. And in the paired comparison, some of the panelists would get this sample first and then this sample. Some would get the red and then the brown. So we would alter order of presentation and they would tell us, are they the same or are they different? We would do a standard number of samples so that, and we have statistical tools, number of samples evaluated, number correct answer, are they different or not? Easy to do. We can also do duo trio. And in the duo trio test, what you do is you give them a control. So half the people get, I should just move these over here again, so that you can do all of this right here. Let me get my other sample.
Okay.
So half the people get the breakfast blend as the control, the other half get the Cafe Olé as a control. And they're told, this is the control. Then they're served these two samples. Half of the ones get this first and this second. The other half get this first and this second. And they have to choose the one that's the same as the control. You want to have at least 60 to 80 people do this evaluation. And then again, you count up the total number of people that evaluated, and you count the number correct, their statistical tables, and you decide if they're different or not. The triangle test they're given 3 samples. 2 are the same and 1 is different. And they're asked to identify the one that's different. And the order is randomized. So if A is sample 1 and B is sample 2, they're going to get A, B, 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 A, B, the second person, B, B, A. The fourth person may get A, A, B, A, B, A, and then B, A, A. So there's 6 different orders. And some of them have the A sample that's different, and some have the B sample that's different. And again, you serve this to a number of people, you count up the total number of evaluations and how many they got right. I'm just going to talk about these three. The nice thing about this has, if they can't tell a difference, it has a 50% guessing rate along with the duo trio test. The triangle test has a 33% guessing rate, but the triangle test and the duo trio test also have a little bit more sensory fatigue because they're having to drink or evaluate 3 products. And so you have to make sure timing between samples and all the product controls are put in place. So all of these tests, these 3 tests will tell you, are the samples different? Okay, Hannah, I'm going to move back over here. So that's discriminative panels, very important. What we do a lot of, okay, now you can move back over here, are descriptive panels. One thing I forgot. On discriminative panel, you can use a trained panel, or you can use a consumer panelist. If you're using trained panelists, they're going to be more sensitive, and you don't need to do as many samples. And they're going to find differences that a consumer panel do not. So depending on the question, you decide which 2 are important. We did an evaluation of tacos for a major food service company, and we decided to use consumers because the differences the trained panel would come up with on the tacos would be probably too sensitive for their real objective. So with descriptive panels, this is the trained panel. You only use trained panels. So descriptive is like what we do. So we only use trained panels. And the purpose of this is to identify the attributes that are in a product and to scale those, to rate them. You can have not only the intensity of an individual attribute, but you can have order of appearance, and you can also evaluate aftertaste. So discriminative panels are good for research because they help us to understand if there are differences, and we can analyze the data statistically. Originally, this method was developed at UC Davis by Marie Pangborn, and it was called the flavor texture profile method. And here panelists would get samples, and they would have an order, and they would identify the attribute, and they would rate it. And at this point in time, it was really a 7-point scale, and then it developed into a 0 to none to 10-point scale, and now we use a 0 to 15-point scale. But what they can also evaluate the order of an attribute when it appeared. But the most important thing is that the panelists come to consensus. So they'd individually evaluate, and they'd sit around a table, and they would decide the rating for an attribute. So example, on a flavor profile, if we're doing my coffee here, since that's what I kind of used as my example today in class, the roasted flavor, the bitter flavor, there might be some chocolate in there, there might be, trying to think what else is in this coffee, musty might be in there, something like that. What do I taste first? Bitter. First would be roasted, second would be bitter, and then I might detect a little bit of musty or something like that. And then I would write the attribute, and I would rate it for how intense it was. Then all the panelists would sit down, and they would come to consensus as far as what order and what attributes and what the rating was. And that was a good way to do things, except for it wasn't, it takes a long time. It takes over an hour to do one product. So the quantitative descriptive analysis technique, and Hannah, I'm going to move over here now. So on descriptive, we talked about the 4 methods. I'm going to put flavor, texture profile method. And then the quantitative descriptive analysis. This was developed by Stone and Seidel in the 80s, and what they said is, that's all good, but wonder if we had a large pool of panelists that were well trained, and we let them basically write their attributes down and give it a scoring, and then we use statistical analysis to put all that together. We wouldn't have to do as much training, and we could do more samples at a time. So the key here is that the panelists are trained, and then they evaluate the product and then use statistical analysis to come to a conclusion. And the nice thing about this is that the data is entered in to the computer. The panel leader is just the facilitator, and they work on consistent terminology, but the panelists are free to develop their own approach. We use a 15-centimeter line scale. And the computer then will take all the attributes and give us a spider web where we can tell differences. So if you look up here, here's an example of a ballot. Here's a spider web. And you can see this happens to be sodium lactate roast. I took some data that I had and created a spider web that had 0, 2, and 4%. And you can see that the 4% has more beefy aromatic and more overall aroma. And only the 2 and 4 are higher than the control for soapy. As you increase sodium lactate, you increase chemical aftertaste, salty, rancid aroma, and only when you get up to the 4% do you start having some of the medicinal aroma. So this is very easy to interpret. You get all the data, you don't have to look at numbers and mean separations. You can tell the difference. It puts it all into one figure. Well, that's all really good, but then Gail Seville developed the spectrum method. And I'm moving over. And the spectrum method said, no, I think we can train panelists. So for flavor or texture, and they use references or a lexicon that defines the attributes. There's always other, so if there's an attribute not on the lexicon, the panelists can identify it. The panel leader plays a stronger role. So instead of them deciding what attributes are here, this one they have a list of attributes with other, and they rate from 0 to 15, with 0 being none and 15 being extremely intense. You can use a 15-centimeter line scale if you want. And this goes across products. They have references. I showed you these references here. These are actual references we use with the panel. They have them available. As you increase in level, you increase in intensity. And we have a beef flavor lexicon, a lamb flavor lexicon, a pork flavor lexicon, and we even have a coffee lexicon. And the key here is that you identify the attributes through ballot development and use an anchored scale. And it's very product specific, and the AMSA sensory guidelines talks about this. So those are the main 3 descriptive analysis techniques. Now I want to get into the third technique, which is consumer. And of course on consumer, we only use untrained panelists because we want them to not be influenced by training, and we ask them their preference or their acceptance. And acceptance, we use hedonic scaling, which means liking. Do they like? What is their degree of acceptance, liking, and what is liked and what is disliked? We can also ask them preference. Which one did you prefer? And we can ask them to rate or rank them in preference. And it's all based on their subjective and personal reaction. In consumer, there's 2 branches of consumer testing. There's qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative is where we do not have data to analyze. And the most common way of doing that is a focus group. We could do, and these are the elements of a focus group. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this. It's basically 8 to 10 people that differ. You have a script, you do an introduction, you have the participants introduce themselves, and you go from general to specific topics. You can have them test or evaluate something. You record all of this, and what you're trying to do is get a feel for what people's responses are. And you try to do this in a neutral environment so that you don't influence them. You can also do it in a panel where you're going to probe them more. And panels are good, and you try to draw out the respondents, but it's a little bit more formalized. We like doing, and these are examples of questions that you would use. I like doing one-on-one interviews better than doing panels because I don't have the influence of what somebody else said on that person, and it really gives me a chance to understand what's going on. So we do one-on-one in-depth interviewing, and we feel that we get a little bit more individual response. You can get some quantitative data if you have a very large N, and it's less dependent on the moderator because you read questions and you write answers, but it takes a lot of time to conduct. For quantitative consumer, we really have 2 types: central location and in-home. So this is quantitative. And what you do here is you still have experimental controls that you want to work with. Consumers sometimes don't like to be in booths, so you might put them in a room like this in 300 where they're individual seated and there's space between them. There could be partitions between them. And the selection of the consumers is what's very important. In the quantitative, you can do central location tests. That's what we do here. What we usually go, we also have done this all across the country. You bring consumers in. They are so many consumers in a session. You prepare the product and you give it to them and they evaluate it. And the advantage of this is that you have all controls of the test environment. You have control of the sample preparation and presentation, the environment. You can control anything about consumers that are unwanted that might influence other ones. You can give them orientation and instructions, and they can do multiple sample evaluations. But the disadvantage of the QLT, or central location test, is it takes more technician and professional time. It can tie up your lab facilities, and it excludes the family opinion. It's not a real environment. And there's also a lot of time and packaging, performance, and it's less suitable for repeated use responses. Another method is the home use test. The home use test, or HUD, is where you send product home with people. And you have to give it some clarity, and you let them use the product in their real world environment, and you send a ballot with them. And the advantage is that it is more real world, but it's a lot more variable. And you can get the influence of preparation and presentation to the family and the family opinion in the ratings. Where the disadvantage is that you're going to get all kinds of cooking effects, and conditions aren't consistent across. I'm going to just go to this. So one of the things I want to just end this with is I've given you, I want you to know these 3 types of panel methods that are used. And I want you to know those factors that influence the sensory verdict, physiological and psychological factors, and something about panel training. And remember, discriminative panels give you, are the samples different or not? Descriptive panels tell you what attributes are present and what are their intensities. Consumer evaluation tells you, do people like it or not like it, and what's the preference. That is one of the most important points of this. I want to show you some data, some multivariate data that looks at some of this. So this is some data on has consumer liking. It has treatments, and it has in green are the treatments, in red are the descriptive attributes, and blue are the consumer attributes. And so things that cluster close are what are liked. And I want you to notice that these are all the consumer attributes, and overall liking is always the attribute of greatest influence. All the consumer attributes are here, meaning that consumers like, if they like the product, they like the juiciness, they like the flavor, they like the grilled flavor, and they like the tenderness. So the red attributes are the descriptive attributes. They're based on the Beef Flavor Lexicon of Adhari et al. 2011. So what flavor, whatever train panel attributes are closest to the overall like are those that consumers like. So samples that had higher overall sweet, fat-like, sweet, bloody serum-y, umami, and salty, consumers liked. What was interesting is that the attributes consumers didn't like were bitter, burnt, smoky, charcoal. So these are off flavors, these are positive flavors. But there's another dimension. Consumers liked it when product had more brown roasted and beef identity, and they didn't like it when it was more serum, bloody, liver-like, or sour. This is stretching it in two different dimensions. So we can link these attributes together, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And these are some wordles from some one-on-one interviews from the same data set. And notice what we can tell here is that consumers, this happens to be from heavy beef eaters and light beef eaters. And notice that the same words were, if the word is bigger, it means it was used more often. Flavor, tender, juicy, beefy, grilled, good are for, regardless of heavy or light beef eaters, we saw very similar attributes. So that's the end. I hope that I know that's pretty fast, and that's a semester of class and a little over an hour. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again, and thank you for being good students in class.